to everybody. My name is Lillian Anderson, and I am the Adult Programs Director at First Church in Belmont. And we're really, really pleased to welcome you to tonight's program, the Midterm Elections with Scott Ferson. Many of you know Scott because he is a long-term member at First Church. He has been across the country and he's been listening to voters. And so he's also, in terms of his background, a former press secretary to Senator Ted Kennedy and strategist for Congressman Seth Kennedy and communications consultant to Congressman Stephen Lynch. Right now, he teaches about elections to the students who I hope are grateful to him at Stonehill College. He also founded the Liberty Square Group, a public relations firm, in 1999, and very importantly, the Blue Lab, an election incubator for first-time Democratic candidates in 2013. And so, without further ado, I am going to turn the program over to Scott Ferson, who I'm going to put on speaker view. And Scott, you are going to carry the program from now on.
Well, thanks, Lillian, and thanks, Debbie, and the committee, and thanks, everybody. It's nice to see everybody. I think when we're anxious about something, it's good to get together and kind of talk it through. When I started teaching as an adjunct 10 years ago at Stonehill, I found the kids intimidating, and the head of the department said, always remember, you know more than they do. And so I know everyone wants to talk about the horse races and the midterm. And so I'm going to save that for the end because that rule doesn't apply to this group. I'm sure a bunch of you, all of you, know more than I do. And we've all been kind of watching this and anxious about it. So I'm going to try and do is frame it out a little bit because of talk about the larger forces that I think are at play that govern what's going to happen in November. And then we can get into that. And I've prepared myself to talk about the horse races and the latest that's going on in the different districts in the Senate and the House. We can talk about that. Just for centering myself, on primary election night in 2014, which was in September, I was with Seth Moulton in his apartment in Salem. He was challenging a 18-year incumbent, John Tierney. We expected to lose, but not by the 56 points our poll indicated that we would lose by 6 months before. His pollster at that time told him there was no credible path to victory and that he should get out of the race. He didn't, and 6 months later on that election night, Seth ended up winning by 10 points, a 66-point swing. Something that I've spent now 8 years trying to figure out why exactly. But we were up there and I had written a victory speech for him just in case. He had not looked at it. Seth was folding laundry, something that calms him. I had told his parents, because Seth had asked them to remain downstairs in the restaurant of his apartment building and not come up to his apartment, that it was going to be a late night. Hopefully, if it was a short night, they should have dinner anyway, because if it was a short night, we were going to lose. But I was hoping it would be a long night, so they should eat, and then we would go down to the VFW hall in Salem after that. And then at 9 o'clock, 9:06, Seth came in his boxers and put the phone down, and he said, "What does this mean?" I said, "What are you talking about?" And he hit it, and it said, the voice said, "Seth, it's John Tierney. I want to congratulate you and your team on the win." Click. And I stood up to go hug Seth. And Seth stepped back and he said, "What? What does it mean?" I said, "You won. He conceded to you. You won." And he said, "What is he basing that on?" Classic Seth Moulton, if anyone knows him. And I said, "Well, he knows way more than we do about the race. We have no idea what we're doing." And I said, call the number back. And he called it back and he said, it's his chief of staff's phone. I said, "You won." And one of the great things in the 40 years that I've done politics that I got to do was to go down to the burger place on the first floor of Seth's apartment. And when I opened the door, Seth's mother looked at me sharply, like the second I walked in the door. And I walked over to her and I said, Mrs. Moulton, John Tierney just called to concede to your son. And it's that type of thing that I think for a lot of people who are involved in politics and this race and other races, the OER, that's the elixir that we take that makes us want to do it. So taking a step back from that, let's talk about the cold, hard mechanics of politics in today. Members of Congress, even Marjorie Taylor Greene, have a lot at stake when they're elected to Congress. They make $175,000. They get funding for a staff when you're a freshman congressman of 18 people, roughly, depending on how you spend it. They are given an office in DC and an office in their home district. Their travel on the government's dime. They start committees to raise money. They have access to power and they wield a lot of power. I don't care if you're Seth Moulton or Nancy Pelosi or Marjorie Taylor Greene. There's a lot at stake individually for these people who are running the 435 in Congress and the 34 that are running in the Senate this year. And they're loath to give it up once they have it. We hear this year that like this, the stakes couldn't be higher. This is the most important election in our lifetime. We hear those things over and over again every 2 years. Well, what about 1980 and the Reagan Revolution? What about 2000 and the election of Bush over Gore? What about 2008? What about 1994 and the Gingrich Revolution? What about 1964 and the shift of the Democratic politics in favor of civil rights and the Republicans away from that? Those were all critical years. And what about history? Really, is this more important than 1860? So far, a member of the House has not yet crossed to the Capitol to club a member of the Senate nearly to death, like was done before the Civil War. What about 1800? The first time a peaceful transfer of power happened in the history of the world. John Adams woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning on March 5th and took the early stage to Baltimore, and he did so. It's the first time in the history of the world that it happened, a peaceful transfer of power in a ugly election. But this is a critical election. And for a couple of decades, each midterm has been framed this way. I'll focus on some key reasons for this. The easiest, as I mentioned, is just the maintenance of power. But the stakes are raised given the existential threats to our survival with climate change as well. And also the inevitable change in the racial makeup of the country in the next couple of decades. When in the 1980s, according to Maggie Haberman's new book, something I'm just now up to the 90s in the book, I'd highly recommend it. When it was pointed out to Donald Trump that the country would become majority minority in and around 2050 or so, he replied, this is in the 80s, quote, no, it won't. There will be a revolution before that happens. That's Donald Trump in the 80s about the inevitability of this becoming a majority minority country. The third factor, I think, is about the influence of money. I don't necessarily mean the effects of Citizens United. It's even the Citizens United is used to raise money in that way. But and it did open the floodgates, absolutely. I mean, in the political, and what I think has become the political industrial complex. Democrat, Republican, and every other letter in between, that's the recipient of money that Nancy Pelosi asks me for every day. Mitch McConnell doesn't ask me for anything. I'm not on his list, but Nancy Pelosi asks me every day for money, as in addition to, I'm sure all of us get a ton of these things. I always think that, I'm always amazed that they can raise it because I just delete them now. Nancy Pelosi, I'm only calling you once, calls every day with I'm only calling you once. I think now the only way to do this would be like, you have to have a heading in the email that says, we have your cat, your house is on fire. Something to make us open up the email gets more and more extreme. But the money that flows into the system, and I'll acknowledge that I'm a card-carrying member of this political industrial complex. So with that, then we can talk about who'll win in November. But let's talk about this, because Congress and the midterms have been weaponized. So let's look at how Congress got weaponized and why Newt Gingrich weaponized it. Pre-1994, the House had a history of quick change from D to R and back, but only briefly when Harry Truman ran against the Do-Nothing Congress of 1946. It ensured that he would then be reelected in 48. He ran against the Do-Nothing Congress in 46. He is the one in his reelection who decided to run against Congress, and Congress changed hands to a Democrat for the 4 years of Truman's presidency. But that's the only time. Before that, from 32 to 46, it was solidly in Democrats' hands. Before that, going historically almost all the way back to the Civil War, was in Republican hands. But from 46 to 48, it was in Republican hands. Truman ran against it. Democrats took it from 48 to 52. In the presidential election year of 52, it changed back with Ike coming in. And for one term from 52 to 54, it was the House I'm talking about was in control by the Republicans. For the next 4 decades, the Democrats controlled the House of Representatives from 54 to 94. 94 in the midterm, Bill Clinton's first term, the Gingrich Revolution nationalized Congress. Before Congress had acted like the first of 3 branches of government. That's how they wielded the power. In fact, Lily and I were talking, and it took me a minute to remember who was Speaker before Newt Gingrich, Tom Foley from Washington. They weren't personalities. They weren't pseudo presidents, speakers of the House. They were just the speakers of the House. Even Tip O'Neill, with an outside personality, wielded his power as the head of the first branch, the first article of the Constitution, the first branch of government. He wielded that in his fights with Ronald Reagan and during the Reagan Revolution, but not as a special outside external force as the head of Congress. So before 94, Congress wielded his power in slow rolling civil rights, building the military to the point where Eisenhower, leaving, warned about the military industrial complex. That was the power of Congress, with bases in all of their districts and the way the power was wielded. But in 94, Gingrich sought to rival Bill Clinton as a leader, or surpass him, I guess, as a leader, maybe in his mind, with the majority behind him. In presidential years, the focus is on the person running. In the midterms, the nationalization of Congress makes them the off-year leaders of a political force. So in presidential years, you always have the 2 personalities of the people who are heading the major tickets. In years like this, we don't. So you get sort of a proxy war. And increasingly what we're finding in 94, that was Gingrich. And that was Gingrich with his agenda for America. And he became as prominent. He became as prominent as Bill Clinton did, and certainly after the huge switch into the Republican control of the House for the first time in 40 years. So we have that phenomenon which has continued. And the parties, the 2 major parties, which on the national level are sort of shells of themselves. The Republicans nominated somebody who wasn't a Republican, Donald Trump. And the Democrats almost did that in 2016 by nominating Bernie Sanders, who's an actual socialist. The parties on the national level have become shells of themselves, and they've really become weaponized through the congressional representation. And those parties have become narrower in their selection of candidates to put forward. So when I visited Marjorie Taylor Greene's district in Georgia, it was clear that people were voting for Marjorie Taylor Greene. People who love Marjorie Taylor Greene. The bulk of the majority, nobody mentioned her when I was down there, and I'll go into my methodology of how I talked about it. But she was the Republican nominee, and they vote Republican in the district, and that's just the facts. Since 94, control has changed 4 times, each in a midterm. They don't change in presidential years, they change in the midterm. 94, 06, 2010, 2018. Yet historically, and we're going to hear, and it's true, historically, the party in power of the White House has lost seats. But the phenomenon we're seeing, I think, is not the 4 or 8 or 12-year swing of control of the presidency. It's the battle every 4 years in the midterms. And that has less to do, I think it's wrong to sort of hang the fact on, in the midterms, the presidential party loses seats, and more that this is the proxy war that's going on between the presidential years. I think that's what we're seeing. And I say this because the dynamics of electing Congress is different from the dynamics in electing a president. The Democrat has won the presidency 7 of the last 8 elections by the popular vote. From 92 to 2020, the Democrat has gotten more votes than the Republican in every year except 2004. On the presidential level, Democrats have a different problem. It's an electoral college problem. But with the Democrats on the presidential year, who knows what 2024 will be, but the Democrats have had no problem 7 of those last 8 years getting more votes on the presidential level than the Republicans. Fun fact, the last 2 Democrats to lose the popular vote in a presidential election were both from Massachusetts, Mike Dukakis and John Kerry. So hoo-hoo. So we've got that to be. Anyway, in Congress, I think it's money and power, and frankly, a pox on both their houses. This is the power that's driving the process. Let's take the year 2020, last year. Guess in your head how much money was spent by these different entities: presidential candidates, Congress, the parties, PACs, independent expenditures. So just for a second, think about that. $4 billion was spent in the presidential election. $4 billion. Congress, $4 billion. By the parties, $3.2 billion. By PACs, political action committees, independent PACs, $13.2 billion. Independent expenditures, people who can give unlimited amounts of money to independent entities in support of candidates, $3.1 billion. Collectively in the year 2020, $27.4 billion was spent. Wow. In addition to that, something, frankly, I hadn't even kind of focused on, didn't know, there's something called electoral communications that corporations and labor can communicate to what's called restricted classes. So unions, their membership, for instance, corporations, their employees. If you spend over $2,000 on this, you must report it to the Federal Election Commission. 74 did. 74 reports were filed in 2020 for a total of $22.7 million, not billion, $1 million spent lobbying or communicating with people who are in your employ or in your control in some way or supervision. That's allowed. To put this in contrast, $27.4 billion in 2020. In 2010, $1.8 billion. In 2018, the last off year, $2.7 billion. I'm sorry, for Congress. So $4 billion in 2020 for Congress. The number will run north of that probably this year in this cycle. 10 years ago, it was $1.8 billion. So that's been the escalation. And Lily and I were chatting beforehand. I've been in rooms as a consultant to candidates or in candidate rooms, and I see a change, in terms of how people are motivated on campaigns. And money is a big motivating factor now in campaigns. And I think that, whether you win or lose, but you get paid, when you think that $27 billion came into campaigns, it went out to advertisers and consultants and field organizers. People get paid. It's a huge fuel of the economy, our political cycle. And the parties in Congress are increasingly speaking to that a narrower band than they have. Let's take a look at the 15 wealthiest congressional districts, just for fun. The wealthiest congressional district is the Virginia 10th, currently represented by a Democrat. I didn't jot down any of these first names, but Wexton, who was elected 2 years ago. Barbara Comstock was the Republican who was in that seat, the wealthiest congressional district in the country, until Wexton beat her 4 years ago. Of the top 5, 3, 4 years ago were represented by Republicans. They're all represented by Democrats now. So in the top, Virginia, California 18th by Anna Eshoo, Maryland 8th, Jamie Raskin, Massachusetts 4th, Jake Auchincloss. There's of the top 10, there is one district, one in Texas that's represented by a Republican. Of the top 15, there's just the one. I'm sorry, two. Todd Aiken's former district in Missouri is still represented by a Republican. And in those past 4 years, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 have flipped from Republican to Democrat. So of the 15, 2 are represented by Republicans and 13 are represented by Democrats. So who are Democrats speaking to or appealing to, or who are listening to that appeal? It's people in wealthy districts. And those include, ultimately, when you go through the top 50, most of whom are represented by Democrats, that's the districts that we live in as well. So even in districts where one party doesn't have a chance, let's take Marjorie Taylor Greene's district, for instance, there's still opportunities to raise money. Or frankly, when you look at Jeff Deal running in Massachusetts and you sort of scratch your head and wonder what he's doing, there's still a lot of money to be raised for Republicans in Massachusetts because of that. The Democratic nominee against Marjorie Taylor Greene is named Marcus Flowers. He's got some great ads up. He seems like a great candidate. Something, frankly, that will appeal to people on this call. He's raised $10 million on the end of the last reporting period, which was June 30th. So he's probably significantly raised beyond that. There is no way that Marjorie Taylor Greene is going to lose that congressional district. No way, no way. I was down there. I had this when I was there on their primary election day. CNN was very excited because there was a Republican who 7-person field on the Republican side who might beat her. And that's the way that it was reported. And when I talked to a county official who was holding a sign running for election, and I said, how do you think Marjorie Taylor Greene's going to do? He said, she's fine. He said, this county official, I needed flags from her and she was quick to do that, but she's not, in terms of the federal emergency money, she does not really responsive. I wish she'd be more responsive. That was his only comment about her. She ended up getting 70% of the vote in the primary. She's going to do the same thing in the general election. And in fact, it's less, so Democrats raise money off of Marjorie Taylor Greene from people like us, because, we just don't get it in any possible way. And yet down there, the view is completely different. And we're putting up a candidate, probably couldn't put up a candidate who would have who would have a chance there. But I've been to her district. I've been to Barry Loudermilk's district, who got into trouble for being in contact with people on January 6th. His district, I spent a week in that district and talked to people. I've been to districts in Ohio and Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, New York, Vermont, Texas, and California as part of something called the OWL Project that I started last year. It's qualitative and not quantitative surveying, if you will. If anyone knows Diane Hessen, who has come up with a great book on the project she did in terms of being in touch with voters for the past 5 years and really listening to them. I'm trying to sort of work off of that model. And it's based on an old yarn that Calvin Coolidge liked about, the wise old owl sat on an oak, the less he spoke, the more he heard, the less he spoke. The more he heard, the less he spoke, the more he learned. Why can't we be like that wise old bird? So I thought maybe I could do that. Maybe I could go out, and if polling is doing these districts and they're asking, how do you feel about the president? How do you feel about Marjorie Taylor Greene? And what do you feel about COVID and all of this? What if we don't talk about any of that and go in and engage voters? What are voters actually talking about? And if we learned what voters were actually talking about, maybe we could, as a partisan Democrat, be responsive to those. Is it really that different? I will tell you, after having spent a month in Tennessee, just handling the estate of my mother-in-law and going to the dog park every day with my golden doodle and my Massachusetts license plates, yes, it's hard for me to understand the discussions about guns and gun culture and all that type of stuff. I will probably never understand that. But most of the stuff, I think, are things that we can understand. So in January, I went out actually to Barry Loudermilk's district. That's the first one in Georgia, and spent a week in Cartersville. And I didn't talk about politics at all. And in fact, I had a rule that there were 7 words I couldn't say, a la George Carlin, the 7 words you can't say on TV. I figured there were 7 words I couldn't say. They were, at the time, they would change now, right? Insurrection, riots, Biden, Clinton, COVID, masks, and Trump. I didn't mention any of those words. That was my rule. I wasn't going to do it. If in conversation with somebody said, I really hate Joe Biden, I would note that, but I would not bring it up. And what's interesting in all of my travels is that people don't. People in any, and this is unscientific, you know, I'm sitting at, I love the Waffle House. I'm sitting at the Waffle House at breakfast. I'm sitting at a coffee shop. You have a lot of coffee. I go around, I buy things in local businesses and talk to them. I go out to dinner. I always do it, I send out teams in 2 because it's always good to engage people like this. One of my colleagues asked, how do you engage people around the country? And I say, well, outside of Boston, people are actually very nice and will talk to you and you can engage them on a whole lot of things. And I had lots of great conversations. In Georgia, in Barry Lytleman's district, I talked a lot about housing, and which is unsurprising up here, we think, but down there, and I sat and I talked to a guy about my age, but he had 7 grandchildren and he was a trained chef. And he said the house that he lived in about 7 years ago had doubled in value. He said, but where would I go? And who could afford to buy my house? And I said, you know what, why do you think that is? And he said, I think it's greed. I think people are just greedy and costs are way out of proportion to what people need. And I'm caught up in that. And if I could sell my place and had a place to go, that would work for me. But why would it work? How is it going to work for anybody else? And then I went into a restaurant, and a guy came up to a waiter and he said, how are you doing? I said, great. I said, how are you doing? He said, you really want to know? And not saying, yes, I do really want to know. I said, sure. And he said, well, I'm getting out of here. I moved down from West Virginia with my kids because to get them out of the opioid traffic in West Virginia, we came down here. And he said, but then my wife got sick, I think maybe cancer. They couldn't cover the bills. They lost their apartment. He says, I'm living in a hotel with the 4 kids. He works. And he said, I keep applying for apartments, but it's $100 application fee. And when they don't select you, they don't tell you, they keep your $100 and they don't tell you why you don't get the money back. He says, I'm out $1,000. He says, I got to get out of here. And I thought to myself, well, as a Democrat, I didn't know that I had no idea that was an issue. Why, that should be part of the Democratic platform this is, but we don't do that. That was sort of the first example. We get to Ohio, to Canton, Ohio, and I was in the hotel, me and my colleague, and so we said, why are you here? We said, well, we're on a little bit of a listening tour. And he said, well, I got a lot to say. He was a government contractor who moved back to Canton because his son had gotten out of jail. And he said, he got back up on his feet. He's got an apartment, he's got a job. Of course, he had to lie on both of those applications, or else he couldn't have gotten either of those things. And he talked about his opioid addiction. In fact, there was a huge sign walking around Canton that clocked the number of people who had been hospitalized for opioids. I mean, but he talked for a long time, and he said, so when he got out, he talked about him being in a for-profit prison, how you had to buy their sneakers. He had to give his son a phone card so that he could call him. That was the only way to communicate with him. And then he said, when he got out, I had to tell him that I had turned him in because I was leaving for Afghanistan and I was afraid when I got back, he'd be dead. And in fact, when he did that and they went through the son's emails, he had talked about robbing a bank to get the money to buy the opioids. And so, the housing situation in Georgia, the gentleman is a government contractor. When they go into the voting booth, what do they do? That's the way I think we need to kind of think about places like this. In Pennsylvania, I drove up to Joe Biden's neighborhood, great neighborhood, looks like any neighborhood in Belmont. College next door, Catholic church across the street, well-tended yards, Victorian homes, great neighborhood. I can see where Joe Biden has that touchstone of that home. But I Zillowed his house, which was the current owner bought it from his grandfather, and it's you can buy it for $70,000. So when I filled up my car for $70 around the corner from Joe Biden's house, it made me think that people in that neighborhood think differently about gas prices than I do. And being there and seeing that brought that, to life for me in a way that I wouldn't have thought. So with that, that's my kind of framing issue. And I think the big sort of question is two takeaways. One immediate, which is, please don't, as much as we want to help, please be very careful about where you're spending your money in this way. And is it going to races where we have a chance to win, or they're going to have an effort? In the Blue Lab, we help candidates really at the local level break in that don't have the resources to do that. We provide sort of basically free bandwidth by college students on local races, state rep races, city council races, municipal light boards for women, people of color, and first-time candidates. I think that, dollar for dollar, your money is better spent if you're finding those candidates who are running at the local level, who may have a chance of winning. Massachusetts just redistricted the local legislature. Every new district, save one, will be represented, and the nominee is a person of color. There will be great new members of the legislature. And so sort of finding those or opportunities around the country is good. The other is sort of this larger thing, which is you can view this, and my kids are on the other side of me on this. They think this is an epic existential battle for our survival. And so this kind of incrementalism, elect Joe Manchins of the world and people who might fit in district and be elected to any of these things is not the way to go. And we need to basically assault the entire system. That's a valid way of thinking about things. I completely understand that. I tend to be on this other school, which is let's go find somebody who can beat Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's a candidate who people in that district would vote for. The nice thing is I think we can do both at the same time. So, but that's the way I think to sort of think about it. With that, and I'll just say this point about the way I look at both the House and the Senate. They're two completely different animals in the way that people vote for them. So let's concentrate on the House, which I think we're going to lose. And I think we're going to lose based on just sheer numbers. Cook Political Report, 537's got a little different take in terms of numbers, but let's just take Cook's. They say we have 193 safe Democratic seats and 211 safe Republican seats. You need 218 seats to get control of Congress. There are 31 in play. The Republicans need 6 of those 31. I just think that there's a million different ways to slice it. And now apparently the Rhode Island congressional seat is in play for Republicans. It could turn out, I hope I'm wrong, it could turn out to be a game where we bet everything on red and we run the table and we win everything. That's basically what we need to do. There's so little margin of error for losing any of these congressional seats for a Democrat to hold on to the House. In the Senate, your guess is as good or better than mine. It's every day. These are really nationalized campaigns in the state level. We're fortunate as a Democrat that there are some truly, truly bad Republican candidates running here. And if the Democrats keep control of the Senate, I want Chuck Schumer to publicly hug Donald Trump for ensuring that because he's the reason why Democrats have held on to the Senate. And I think we also have to take an assessment that, Doug Jones was a great senator, but he beat somebody who was a known pedophile and then immediately lost later to Tommy Tuberville, who has a hard time stringing two sentences together. So in Alabama, the bar needs to be changed significantly if we're going to. It's not good enough just to put up good candidates. These states are very different, but I would put it as a toss-up, maybe slightly leaning the Democratic way, that the Democrats keep the Senate, particularly with the vice presidency. But I think it's very, very hard to hold on to the House for the Democrats. So with that, I'll pause.
Are there any questions? And if there are, I think I'll put it into gallery view, and so I can see whether or not you actually have your hand up, or whether or not I don't see anything in the chat. So yes, Jane.
Hello, thank you, Scott. So, I mean, what I heard you saying is that, it's sort of, Republicans are the person on Main Street is worried about the dinner table, and then and that's sort of the Republicans, the dinner table and the gas pump, and we progressives here are worried about losing democracy, and it's so should we be talking about, and we know we're losing the whole ability to have fairness in play and stand up for democracy is kind of this existential question, but that doesn't seem to bother the person who, whose son who's, opioid addicted, or, is living in a hotel room. I mean, because, Maslow, I mean, that's just not their hierarchy of needs.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, this assault on democracy, you look at polls for people 25 and under, they're not so into democracy, because they're faced with this existential threat. And is democracy going to solve their problems? I think they think maybe it won't, and that maybe there's another way to do it. I mean, the Bernie Sanders phenomenon is our version of the Trump phenomenon. Don't yell at me, just wildly different in terms of what they do, but that same kind of, I'm just going to go in and do it, is appealing to young people. I get it completely. It's not appealing like I'm going to overthrow democracy like Trump is. So I understand that. But I mean, in terms of that urgency of doing things, there's a wide swath. And since when out in these districts that I go to that are represented by Republicans, and not all of them, is that they're not thinking of their congressional person as kind of a local representative. They're nationalizing it as well. So they're getting lost in that. So there's that. I think the way, and I don't think, maybe I'm wrong in terms of this. I think we should talk about the assault on privacy. Because privacy, we know the assault on reproductive rights, but is that going to appeal to certain demographics in some of these places? Well, an assault on privacy, which is not mentioned in the Constitution, people don't know that. So it's like, well, my privacy is fine. It's an assault on your privacy. And if I think the systematic dismantling of the right to privacy is going to touch every American. That's what they want. I mean, this is the revolution that Donald Trump talked about 40 years ago. We're not going to let our country be taken over by them. We're going to control it in this way. We have to make this existential threat to democracy, and you're exactly right, understandable to everybody, because it is an assault on everybody.
Other questions? And let me just say that I think you've given us so much to think about, Scott. The reason why people are slow to ask these questions is we're still digesting what you have just said. And so I think that's the reason why, and you may have answered all their questions. I don't know.
Well, I've got one for you, Scott.
Okay, Mont.
Sure. So you're saying that in the House, the Republicans, at least according to one group, have pretty much 211 sure wins, and they just need another 6 or 7 to get to 218. And I'm assuming that's different in terms of that sweep towards Republican voting that will benefit in the House, that is different from the Senate, because in the House, these are districts that maybe tend to be either Republican or democratically controlled, or the gerrymandering. I guess I just look for an explanation. Why would Democrats be doing better in the Senate than in the House? I'm assuming that the Senate's are statewide elections, and therefore there's more diversity somehow, and popular vote wins.
Yeah, I think if Republicans had put up, if the incumbents were running in Pennsylvania, if the incumbent was running for re-election in Pennsylvania, if there were better candidates in Arizona, Georgia, they would win. Because I think they just would. So there are enough people on statewide to vote for. I mean, this is, I think, why Scott Brown beat Martha Coakley. There was something, as a keen observer of that race, 400,000 people voted for my boss, Ted Kennedy, in 2006, who voted for Scott Brown 3 years later. Why? And I think they sort of saw something in Scott Brown that appealed as somebody we wanted in a senator. It appealed for a very short period of time before Elizabeth Warren took him out. But there was, and I think people on the Senate level do that. There are going to be a lot of Warnock Kemp voters in Georgia who will, vote, think Kemp's a legit candidate, I'm going to vote for it, but that will vote for Warnock based on the dynamics of the personalities. And they tend not to do that in congressional. So like Alan Fung, the Republican in the second district in Rhode Island against Seth Magaziner, he's a legit candidate, which is why in a district that should not go Republican, he could win that seat because they've got a good candidate there. But that's not usually the norm. It's more, a Democrat came in on a presidential year 2 years ago. That's why there are more Democrats seats of the 31 who are vulnerable. They've just been in there for a short period of time. Those aren't really Democratic seats. And the question is, if they've got a legit candidate, they're just going to flip back. And I think that's what there's just enough of them. What I did not do for the analysis is to overlay the question of the repeal of Roe in those districts. So clearly it's going to have an effect because the numbers of women who are registering to vote are way higher than the numbers of men, just nationwide. But I didn't do the breakdown into those 31 districts to see whether it's enough that it would affect any of those. And frankly, it would have to affect 25 of them, of the 31, to hold on to the House. There's just long odds.
Other questions? Okay, Jean, is there anybody other than somebody who has?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I apologize. I thought I was.
Mott was muted.
I didn't realize I was muted. I like your response. And I just have a question in terms of my asking about gerrymandering. Is that having an effect in the congressional races?
Yeah, we lost those. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, what we didn't lose, the courts have helped to overturn in some instances. Yeah, no, it's not good.
You're still on mute, Mott.
So sorry. Are you aware of any findings that show like how many seats will likely be lost to gerrymandering?
I have not done the analysis on those 31 to see which ones will lose because of gerrymandering.
Okay.
Okay. Anybody have any other questions? This is a quiet group.
Yeah.
Oh, come on.
Okay.
But I just want to say that was a wonderful story you told at the beginning, Scott, about Seth Moulton. That's very memorable. And I hope we get some surprises like that with this midterm to our favor. Go ahead, Jean.
All right. So the gas pump in Russia and in Saudi Arabia, I mean, this is just 11th hour. This is like the worst timing.
You know, so when I was, where was I? I was in Illinois, in Carbondale, maybe, and I went into this. You try to find the coffee place where you're getting locals, like you don't go to the Starbucks. So it's like, you know, you find that little coffee place. So I thought I'd found it was an Amish coffee place, and I had coffee there 3 days. And then when I went the last day, there was a line, and I didn't talk to anybody in the Amish coffee place. Nobody engaged. And I went to the Hardee's next door. They were all there. I had to go to the Hardee's for coffee. So I'm learning these things as I go through. And I'm sitting, and there's a group of farmers there. They're showing pictures of their tractor. They're all retired. And they're going to it's like, I just got this tractor, and they're showing this and showing that. And they were talking about the price of gas. They were not blaming Joe Biden. They were talking about, you know, Russia and how it's having an effect on prices, but they were talking about the effect on prices. So then so when they go in to vote, I don't get the sense that they're voting against Joe Biden, you know, because I didn't get any of that sentiment, again, from this anecdotal thing. But then what do you do? You know, prices are hurting your ability to farm or fish, the cost of gas in Massachusetts to fish, or travel, truck, whatever it might be. What do you do? And do you vote for the incumbent? Do you vote for the challenger? Do you try to send a message? So it's that, I think that's the conversation we have to have. But I did not in any of this, people are concerned with the president's cognitive ability. Absolutely. People discount nonsense, what they consider to be nonsense about all of this discussion about personalities, and on either side. You know, they don't talk about AOC, and they don't talk about Marjorie Taylor Greene. They don't. Most people I talk to do not care. It's very, you know, pocketbook issues. We talk about that, but I don't know that we really ultimately kind of know that. I walked with my young colleague. I took him out to Canton, Ohio, and we walked to the McKinley Museum, which was awesome. And we went through this neighborhood, and we were both pretty quiet. It was a working class neighborhood, but some windows were missing. And I noticed two things about it. One was that I heard no dogs. Think about the last time you walked through on a warm day and didn't hear pets. But pets cost money. And this was not a neighborhood where there were a lot of pets. There were there were kids going to school and all this type of stuff. I also Zillowed, there was a house for sale, and I Zillowed it, and I realized that if I sold my house in Belmont, I could buy 38 of them.
Wow.
And so the way I'm thinking about politics and voting is way different than the way that they're thinking about it.
Well, that is a sobering thought, what you just said, the numbers. Any response to that?
What state was that, Scott?
It was Canton, Ohio.
So I did ask Scott at the very beginning. Go ahead, Kathy. You need to unmute.
Here we go. There you go. Got it. I haven't heard you say anything yet about the young male black vote, which I've been hearing lately is kind of backing away. Won't have anything to do with any of it now. Is there any truth to it? Is it something that's temporary? And as we get, well, we're too damn close to say as we get closer.
Yeah.
What are you hearing, and what do you think? Where is this coming from? There are some, a lot of reasons, but where do you think is the central core of those reasons?
Right. So when you look at the fight over the changing demographics in the vote, and we've had 6 political parties in the history of the country. We're at this one where they're realigning. The parties are realigning in this way. The one thing I think will not change is the rock solid backbone of the Democratic Party is African American women. Absolutely. And in huge numbers, both in turnout and in voting Democratic. African American men have never been voting in those same kind of levels anyway. And Donald Trump made some inroads in the African American male vote in 2016 and in 20. There's a certain appeal to that, which I think isn't a whole lot different than the kind of the appeal you see in other demographics because of this. And same thing and kind of on our side on the Bernie Sanders sort of phenomenon. They may decide, African American males may decide the Senate race in Pennsylvania, where they come down, which will be interesting. Which, I think, I can see Fetterman as a certain appeal in that way to that demographic and even a rural demographic. He's got a different coalition. The one that's the part of the electorate that's growing exponentially, and the vote. The African American vote in the electorate is 10%. It has been forever. It will be 10%. So the real fight's going to be over the Hispanic vote, which isn't, is divided into a lot of different categories, but that's growing at a significant rate. The white vote in presidential years has gone from 1980, 92% to in the high 60s now. So it's the growth of the Hispanic vote and a little bit of Asian population, but mostly Hispanic, and that's where it's going to be. But in tight races, where African American men vote could swing elections, most notably in Pennsylvania.
I see that Monty has joined the call, and I was just about to say toward the end of this program that Monty Allen is going to be doing a program on this Sunday in the parlor in person, 12:30, on his experiences in canvassing people in rural Wisconsin. So I'm glad you're joining us even for a brief period of time, Monty. But anybody have any other questions for Scott before we sign off? We're just about close to an hour. Any final words? I asked Scott at the very beginning if he would leave us with some positive message or hopeful message or some story or whatever he wanted to leave us with. I think you've told some really interesting stories, as Debbie has said, about some people and your experiences in being with them. Are there any final questions? Brian, did you have?
Yeah, I do. I'm just curious, Scott, and you're out of 435 congressional races, how many of them do you consider to be competitive? It's such a difficult thing here in Massachusetts, and I suspect the same is true in Wyoming and other places where it's just all rock solid. Just curious what your take is. And that to me feels like an interesting question, like, where the barometer moves in any midterm election, where are you sort of looking at to really gauge that change?
Yeah, I mean, and most of it, is rock solid. You're right. I mean, the fight in Wyoming was in the primary, right? It's not at all in the general. Marjorie Taylor Greene, when she ran the first time, when I was down there, I didn't know this at the time, but her Democratic opponent had to move out of state because he got divorced and had to leave the house, and he moved back to Indiana, and so she was basically alone on the ballot. So we didn't even put up anybody in her district 2 years ago or 4 years ago, whenever she first ran. When you look at New Hampshire, the Chris Pappas district in New Hampshire, the first district, that flipped every 2 years for, I think, a period of 10 years, back and forth and back and forth. So of those districts that you're talking about, there's 30, Cook pegs it at 31. I would say you could pare that down, frankly, where you could, if you really drilled down into those districts, you could always, I think in a competitive, if somebody always says, well, Massachusetts Congressman Keating's district is competitive for Republicans. Well, not really. So there's going to be some that are even tighter than that on that 31 list that aren't really going to end up being competitive, or if you put money on it, you'd make some good solid money. So, but I think ultimately when you get down to election day, you're going to be looking at maybe a dozen that will determine either Republicans will kind of tighten. I can't say that. I think we'll get to election day and you won't know, because you do have this repeal of Roe phenomenon going on, and I will say two other things. There's uncertainty in the electorate. There's volatility in the electorate. There is in Massachusetts. There is around the country. I'm doing the comms for the ballot initiative, question 4 on the driver's licenses. There's volatility in the electorate. We cannot take anything for granted on any race that's up on the ballot questions. I think not so much on the state level, but around the country, there's uncertainty and volatility. The other thing is there's always, you never know who's gonna, and this terrifies people like me, you never know who's gonna show up to vote, who you didn't anticipate would show up. And that's happened the past 2 presidential cycles. So if that happens, anything could happen. It could be that we're seeing this anger on the repeal of Roe, and Kansas wasn't sort of a one-off, and we're seeing it sweep into the congressionals. I just didn't look at it that closely on those 30 races.
How about your horse race guess on the Senate? What's your expectation in the end?
This is where I'm definitely an optimist about this stuff. I mean, you work for Seth Moulton, you're 56 points down. You have to show up at work the next day. You have to have some kind of hope on this type of stuff. But I'm nervous about Pennsylvania and Georgia. I don't like where the polls are. I think we need more. I think we need pads on those polls for Fetterman and Warnock. And so I'm worried about that. And if we lose that, that's the game. We're done. But being the optimist, I think we hold on. I'd like to think we win both of those. Particularly Raphael Warnock in Georgia is an unbelievable candidate and senator. Unbelievable. And the change would be enormous if he wasn't reelected. So just for somebody who cares about the Senate, I would like to see that happen.
I'm sorry to have joined late. I will look at the recording. Forgive me if you've already gone over this, but do you think that African-American men in Wisconsin will turn out for Mandela Barnes? And will that be enough to turn the tide his way?
Yeah, so I'm going to turn that back on you, Monty, not having been to Wisconsin, but you have. Give us a report from the ground.
Well, my sampling size is tiny. And my job was voter identification and not turning out the vote. And the areas I was in, I didn't talk to any Black people. So the question I have is, will the high concentrations of Democratic voters in Madison and the greater Milwaukee area, will the African-American men be mobilized and motivated enough to turn out in the numbers that would be required to take Mandela Barnes to victory?
Yeah, it's the only thing I'll note on that is that I don't know that phenomenon happened in the Obama races necessarily. So I don't know, for whatever reason, that the appeal isn't. I mean, I will never forget waking up on Inauguration Day in 2009 in our hotel in Washington, very, very early in the morning, because there was just some reason to wake up. And I looked out the window at 4 o'clock in the morning, and it was a sea of people dressed in their finest on the most frigid day. And the faces that stand out to me are African-American women in that crowd going up there. And so when you're talking about an African-American candidate in Wisconsin or in Georgia, I'd have to know more about whether it's actually motivating in a way that it might be for other populations. I don't know that it is in that way.
Hey,
Well,
Scott.
there are some rural districts in Wisconsin that voted twice for Obama. So just
Yeah, see, that's kind of like crossover appeal.
Well, Monty, we don't want to give them the entire show. We want them to come on Sunday. So, we're looking forward to hearing more about what your experiences were like in rural Wisconsin. So
Sorry, Lillian, to interrupt. Can I just ask one quick question?
go right ahead, Debbie.
You referred to a book in the very beginning of your talk that you were I think you said you were in the process of reading it. Could you say that book name again?
So it's Maggie Haberman's book. What's the
Confidence Man
Confidence Man?
about Donald Trump.
It's incredibly well researched. It's very, very good.
Hey, Scott, one last before you go. October surprise. Has that historically been presidential elections, or has that been manufactured ever in congressional, off-year elections?
Help me out, someone if anyone remembers it. I mean, it is a phenomenon that's associated with presidential.
Okay.
Yeah. What does the Ukraine and escalation, nuclear Armageddon, how does that affect a midterm? I don't know.
Yeah.
I have to think that it's not that Russia and the Saudis, and I mean, is that October surprise coming from somewhere? So I feel like that has to be, I think there's some manufacturing of things, or at least not trying to help the Democrats in holding things. So I don't know if it's a surprise as much as a strategy.
Yeah. In terms of October surprise, Brian, to your question, I would also recommend Garrett Graff's book, Watergate, A History. Whereas now 50 years later, it's just an incredible comprehensive history of Watergate for those of us who were alive during it and read everything since then. It's from the Chenault affair, from what Nixon tried to do on the eve of the election in '68, all the way up through Watergate. It's a fascinating read, and I don't know that this is warming in terms of but you read it, you see the parallels to today. It's unbelievable. So it's a good context to say that this isn't. We've lived through this before.
And I think,
Lillian, if I can I don't want to end on a downer here, but I am just awfully curious, Scott. As we all know, inflation may be the thing that decides these midterms. But as we all know here on this call, every country in this world is experiencing this. It's not just the US. And I think there's this sense that Republicans are going to blame those in power, Biden and the Democrats. When you go out and talk to all the people you talk to in the coffee shops, is it your sense that these voters are not aware of things like that they're not educated enough, that they don't read enough of the right sources to know that inflation is a worldwide problem? Is this just a Fox News OAN problem where they're just being brainwashed? I mean, the Republicans who are making decisions, do you sense that they understand and are just for some reason choosing to vote for the Republican, despite the fact that it's not the Democrats' fault, for inflation as an example?
Yeah. And so I think, two things. One is, I could have told you in February that the president needs to do something on gas prices, if he was attuned with what people were saying. It may not have been responding to it in the way that people were feeling it the best policy. So I'd leave that up to the president. But when I was out there, that's what people were feeling. It was putting gas in their car. And you go, in Tennessee, I realized in conversation that most people in this country have never been on a train. They just don't, they aren't there. They don't, they haven't. So people are driving, and they're putting gas in their car. So that's the choice that they have. I also realize how much of this country, 40% of this country is farmland, the physical space. When you're out there, and I grew up here, I've only been here, and you're out there, and that makes you think that, it's not, there's not a lot of representatives in it's exactly the same, it's not a lot of representatives, but those that do carry huge weight, because it's physically 40% of the country. So you start to see those types of things. So the gas, baby formula, the cost or the availability of it when you need to feed your baby and you can't get it in the United States of America, you want to blame somebody. And so I don't think that they're like, I never heard that Biden, I did this little stickers. I saw those when I was traveling around, but those are haters, right? That would put that on there. I'm just amazed that they went back after the prices came down and took all those little stickers off. And so you didn't see that, but the people I was talking to weren't blaming Biden for either of those things. But if gas is prohibitive and if you can't get baby formula, that's a problem that you're going to remember when you go into the voting booth.
Yeah.
So I think that you've given us a great gift, Scott, and I will return to what I said at the beginning of the program. I hope your students at Stonehill College are grateful for having you as a professor. We are certainly grateful for all of the information that you've given us tonight. And so I hope we all appreciate the fact that Scott has done this, and hopefully he'll come back at some other point and do another program, because we have learned a great deal. I also want to remind you that what Scott said at the very beginning is important to keep in mind, that we've had periods in our history which have been worse than where we are now, although it feels like we should have this view of bleakness and despair. Just remember that we've lived through a lot and we will live through this as well. So anyway, I appreciate the fact that you've been with us, Scott, and I know everyone else has too. And I hope everybody goes to a nice evening ahead of you.